Many of us, of course, remember many years ago when Constantine Menges used to encourage us, and we used to go to him, and he would always have some ideas as to what was the best way of proceeding or trying to advance the cause of human rights throughout the hemisphere. I think it's fair to say that now, after almost a year, when President Obama announced his policy, and after a couple of years since the negotiations between the White House and Raul Castro began, that as Senator Robert Menendez and others in the Congress have indicated, one could take a look and see what the results are, or at least the beginning of the results. And as far as human rights in Cuba, I think we could say that the Cuban regime has been emboldened by the policy of concessions, by the White House. As was indicated, General Raul Castro insisted that the Cuban regime be removed from the list of countries that support international terrorism. And the administration did that, despite the fact that today you could go to the FBI webpage and you will find that the FBI to this day continues to offer $1 million for information leading to the capture of an American terrorist who killed a New Jersey trooper in cold blood, who was sentenced to life in prison, who escaped and remains in Cuba enjoying the hospitality of the Cuban government. I think that's a good example of the kind of policy that the White House has. The President's idea of foreign policy is far different from the foreign policy of all former American presidents, where American interests were supposed to be in the forefront, where supporting America's allies are supposed to be part of a mix, and we're opposing enemies or government hostile to America was supposed to be part of a foreign policy. All of that has been turned upside down. The President extends a hand of friendship to governments that are hostile to the United States, and the President basically turned his back or ignores the needs and the important requirements of America's allies. On the issue of human rights, I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about Cuba, first of all, lots of us sometimes talk about Cuba. Cuba is not a geographical expression. Cuba is basically 11 million people. When we talk about Cuba, sometimes the word Cuba is used to talk about the Cuban government. The Cuban government is basically a dynasty. The dynasty, the way it's, you have a dynasty in North Korea, you have a dynasty in Syria. The President ignores many things. For example, when the President went to the UN and met with General Castro, right by the side of General Castro was Lieutenant Colonel Alejandro Castro Spin. He is the son of Raul Castro, and he is very important in the security forces in Cuba. And the expectation is that he will have a role to play in the affairs, business affairs of the Castro family. The Castro family sees Cuba as their property, and one has to take that into account. Some political scientists are now saying that Cuba is in a post-totalitarian model, and that's probably the case. Some things, a few things have changed, but that does not mean that there has been a significant change in the situation of the Cuban people or of human rights in Cuba. Cuba remains a totalitarian government with only one political party. After the revolution came to power in '59, there were many expectations by many people, by most of the Cubans. But more than half a century later, there's no freedom of speech in Cuba. There's no freedom of association in Cuba. There's no rule of law. There's no separation of powers. The Cuban government sometimes talks about civil society. You got to be careful when you hear words coming from Havana. The Cuban government talks about NGOs, non-governmental organizations. What the Cuban government calls non-governmental organizations is what Fidel Castro used to call the mass organizations. This is something like the Federation of Cuban Women that are a Cuban government organization. These are labor unions, are basically labor organized by the labor unions in Cuba. A job is to make sure that the workers are disciplined, that no worker wants to ask for the right to strike, that workers do not talk about collective bargaining, that no worker wants to know why they're forced to work weekends and they don't get paid. So that's the kind of thing. And those are the NGOs that some people now in Washington are saying that they ought to be the recipients of American assistance, because for years the United States has been trying to encourage civil society, the growth of civil society in Cuba, respect for human rights in Cuba. Now the Cuban government wants to turn that upside down and say that American taxpayers ought to be subsidizing the Cuban government organizations that are in there to oppress the people of Cuba. As far as the political prisoners are concerned, and this is a measure of the Obama administration in Cuba, since December 17 there has been an increase, a measurable increase, substantial increase in the number of political detentions in Cuba. As has been reported, the Amnesty International, to its credit, after December 17 said that if all there was going to be was these exchanges between Washington and Havana, the whole thing would be a smoke screen to cover the violations of human rights in Cuba, the denial of basic freedoms in Cuba. It was alluded about the situation of Cuban workers. Cuban workers get paid the equivalent of $20 a month or $25 a month. The Cuban workers do not have any say in where they will work or in the conditions of the work. As it was indicated, when a foreign company goes to Cuba, and they need any workers, the government provides the workers, the company pays the Cuban government for the workers, and then the workers get a small percentage. And they have to be very obedient, very disciplined. If they say anything about the negative impact of the companies, for example, the Sherritt nickel mine, it's a Canadian company in Cuba, that has tremendous negative impact on the environment. They use coral for their operations that's taken from the bottom of the sea near Cuba. If any worker in Moa, in the mine, were to say something about all the junk that comes out of the chimneys, and the Cuban children are told to wear shirts, because otherwise they get skin problems. Well, that worker quickly, the government takes them away, and so the company has no problem with the workers. The policy of the administration toward Cuba resembles the very bad old policy many years ago, when the United States was basically befriending dictators. There's no difference between what happened in the 40s and 50s when Washington was embracing Batista, Trujillo, and many others that many people have complained about, and President Obama embracing Raul Castro. Whatever the administration is trying to do, whatever they say, is not helping out the people of Cuba. Many Cubans are kept in prison today for months, sometimes for years, without having going to a trial. An interesting case is an artist, a graffiti artist who was named El Sexto, who, with a great sense of irony, painted the word Raúl on a pig and Fidel on another pig. And he was grabbed by the police last December, and he was just released about a week ago after being in the midst of a hunger strike. And he was released because many human rights organizations around the world denounced the situation. He was never taken to court. Do I have time? Okay. There's another case. There are many other cases. There's a woman who went to the mass when a couple of years ago the German Pope went to Cuba. Sonia Garro. She had a sign that says freedom. They grabbed her, and she was detained in March 2012, and she was released in December 2014, and for that crime of putting out a sign saying freedom. During the last visit of the Holy Father of Francis to Cuba, 3 Cubans approached him. They gave him a piece of paper calling for human rights in Cuba. They were promptly picked up by the police. They have been incommunicados since then, and they're political prisoners in Cuba. And we're currently, people ask us, well, what can you do about it? There's a lot that you could do about it. Among other things, you might want to send a note to the Holy See. You might want to talk to your bishop. I think the Catholic Church has a responsibility to get these folks out of prison. The whole situation of human rights in Cuba is central to the debate on U.S. national security. American security will be much better, in a much better position the day that there is a free and democratic government in Cuba. A government that does not support international terrorism, a government that does not encourage anti-American efforts throughout the hemisphere. We don't have to try to project what Raúl Castro will be doing in the next couple of years under the Obama administration. We know what he has done to date. For example, a Cuban North Korean ship carrying Menges was intercepted in the Panama Canal. And those were warplanes that were on their way to North Korea. This happened during the Obama administration, while the Obama administration was negotiating with Havana. The role of Cuba in support of Syria, in support of North Korea, in campaigning against Israel at the United Nations is very well documented. So while the United States is extending a hand of friendship to Raúl Castro, one, the human rights in Cuba are worse today than they were before the negotiations with the Obama administration. The Obama administration remains mostly silent on these issues. They continue to say that, well, we're going to discuss them, but discussion on human rights with the Cuban government always go at the very end of any process. The European Union began discussing politics with Havana several years ago, and they still have not gotten to human rights. One way of measuring the human rights situation in Cuba is very simple. The Cuban government continues to deny entry to Cuba or to Cuban political prisoners to the International Committee of Red Cross, to Amnesty International, and even to some members of Congress who have talked about human rights in Cuba. Every Sunday, there's a group of Cuban women called the Ladies in White who go to church in Havana, dressed in white, calling for freedom for political prisoners. Every Sunday they get beaten. Every Sunday they get dragged to prison. And sometimes they're 50, 60, sometimes they're several hundred. So the question on human rights in Cuba and the Obama-Cuba policy can be summarized very basically. If the president, having made all those concessions to Cuba, cannot convince Raul Castro to stop beating innocent, peaceful women on their way to church on Sunday, what can you expect from this administration in regard to human rights in Cuba? Thank you very much.